नयनों में प्रेम धार, वचनों में अमृत धार, सतगुरु साई मेरा जीवन का धार। नयनों में प्रेम धार, वचनों में अमृत धार, सतगुरु साई मेरा जीवन का धार। जीवन आधार मेरा जीवन का आधार, सद्गुरु साई मेरा जीवन का आधार। नयनों में प्रेम धार, वचनों में अमृत धार, सद्गुरु साई मेरा जीवन का आधार। Dear Swami, loving pranams at your lotus feet. Respected elders, brothers and sisters, Sai Ram. In the previous edition, when we were ruminating on Bhagawan's message about the grandeur and beauty of the Bharatiya culture, in the last two episodes we were talking about how Bhagawan defines Bharatiya culture, or a Bharatiya as somebody who believes that the Atman or God is all-pervading, is there in every being, is present in every bit of creation. So that we said is Bhagavan says is the foundation of the Bharatiya culture. And in the last episode we were talking about how does that translate into day-to-day living, what are its implications for day-to-day living. And we said, we spoke about how Bhagavan says Sarva Rupa Dharam Shantam Sarva Nama Dharam Shivam Sachidananda Rupam Advaitam Satyam Shivam Sundaram. It's the Lord who takes on all names and forms, and thus Sarva Jiva Namaskaram Keshavam Pratikachati, Sarva Jiva Tiraskaram Keshavam Pratikachati. Thus, all harm that we do to other beings actually is harm done to the Lord Himself, and all love, all care that we share, all respect that we share with other beings or anything in creation eventually reaches the Lord Himself, because the Lord is present in everything, in everybody. In fact, the Lord alone is. Now, there are some practical questions which brings us up. How do you implement this? Now, if you look at the 9-point code of conduct which Bhagavan has prescribed for devotees and for members of the Sri Sathya Sai Seva organization, one point in the code of conduct is speak softly and lovingly to everyone who you come into contact with. Now, how do you actually do this? There are many examples, but one point which Bhagavan always makes is that if you really wish to, there is always a nice way to say something. Let me give you some examples from Bhagavan himself. For example, when Bhagavan would travel from one place to the other, so Bhagavan would be with students in, say, Vrindavan or in Prashantinilayam, and then Bhagavan is going elsewhere. Now, naturally, the students wouldn't want Bhagavan to leave their physical presence and go, right? Even you want to be in Bhagavan's physical presence, so why? So they would, they wouldn't want Swami to go. But Swami would teach them that you should never tell Swami, don't go. Povaddu in Telugu, Swami Povaddu, Swami, don't go. So you wouldn't want students to say don't go. Instead, he would encourage students to say, Swami, Toraga Ravali. which means don't say don't go, but say, Swami, please come back quickly. Now you're conveying the same thing, but it's a much more positive way to convey this. So if you, irrespective of what you have to convey, because the code of conduct says speak sweetly, softly and lovingly. So softly, lovingly, how do you say it? So even something like, don't go can be conveyed as come back quickly. Now, that's an example. Another very simple but very powerful example is, when you count numbers in Telugu, like in English, when you say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, in Telugu it's counted as follows: Okati, Eradu, Moonu, Nalugu, Aidu, Aru, Edu, Enimidi, Tommidi, Padi, 1 to 10. Now, interestingly, Bhagawan makes a small but powerful variation to these words when he counts in Telugu. Bhagawan says Okati, Rendu, Moonu, Nalugu, Aidu, and after Aidu comes 6, Aru. After Aru comes 7, which is Edu. Now, interestingly, I've heard Swami say Aidu, Aru. He doesn't say Edu for 7. He says Aru Nokati. Aru Nokati means 6 plus 1. Now, why does he say 6 plus 1 and not say Edu? Because in Telugu, the word Edu also means crying. When somebody cries, they say Edustunnadu. Now, crying is not something which is pleasant, it's morose, and Bhagawan defines a spiritual person as somebody who's always cheerful. So even there, if you see, Bhagawan doesn't use a negative word like crying. Instead of saying Edu for 7, he says Aru Nokati. Now, it's such a simple thing, often we may not notice it, but what a profound lesson that, you can project or you can speak about everything positively if you really wish to, if you apply your mind. But then there'll be situations where you have to say no to somebody. Now, you can't say yes to somebody always. But the question is, even when you say no, how do you say no lovingly? How do you say the no in a manner which is as palatable as possible? So there's an experience of one of Bhagawan's devotees. He was a services person. In fact, he was in the armed services, serving the nation for a long time. And what happened is that once he retired, he was back in India and he was in government service in a very, very important position where, if he really wanted to, he could actually, he controlled a department. He was heading a department which actually was responsible for recruiting people for government jobs. Now, naturally, when you're in that kind of a position, you are likely to be under a lot of pressure, political and otherwise, and a lot of recommendations which would come to his office, asking him, requesting him to actually grant jobs to certain people. Now, this gentleman is very upright, is very ethical, very high standards he holds. So whenever a recommendation would come, he would flatly refuse and say, no, not possible, I can only go on merit. But naturally, there were a lot of pressure which came upon him and it became unbearable. And it came to a point where he decided that he will just resign his job, but because he just couldn't put up with it, because he was day in and day out forced to do things which according to him were not ethical, were not moral. So he decided to resign. Before he resigned, he decided to send a telegram to Bhagawan saying, he sent a message to Prashant Nilayam saying, Swami, I would like to resign from the services. Bhagawan immediately sent a telegram back saying, don't resign, come to Prashant Nilayam. Now he was in Bhagawan's presence. And when he was in Bhagawan's presence, Swami referred to this challenge that he was facing and said, Bangaru, the problem with you is that you don't know how to speak. And then Swami gives an invaluable message. He says, you may not always be able to oblige, but you can always speak obligingly. You may not always be able to say yes, but you can always say it nicely. And then Bhagawan gives him a solution. Bhagawan says, the next time somebody comes to you with a recommendation, don't tell them no. Just tell them, I'll try. But don't do anything out of the way. Stick to your rules, stick to the procedures of the organization, stick to what is ethical and moral. Now Bhagavan says what would happen then is that if the person who was recommended were to get a job, then whoever came up with this recommendation would believe that it was because of your effort that the person got the job. And if the person doesn't get the job, probably the person who recommended would assume that you tried your best, but still that person couldn't get through. Either way, you manage the situation better. So you cannot oblige, but you can always speak obligingly, because there will be situations where you actually will have to say no. But an important point to also ponder on here is Bhagavan says, speak softly and lovingly to everyone whom you come into contact with. Now, how about a situation where you come into contact with somebody who is troublesome, who brings out your anger, who you feel will cause harm to you? So Bhagavan says simple solution, A, B, C, avoid bad company. And bad again doesn't mean that person is bad, but that person is bad for you. So it's like when you eat a certain type of food, it's not that the food per se is bad, but the food is bad for your cholesterol, for your diabetes, or for your health. So again, the judgment is not on the food or the person, but the judgment is actually on what it does to you. So something which is, when you come into contact with people who will, in whose presence you're likely to not speak softly and lovingly, Bhagavan says avoid that company. So Bhagavan says there's always a nice way to say things. There's always a nice way to look at situations, contexts, etc. But when you if there's a situation where you feel somebody is not going to be good, is likely to cause you to go astray from the path of speaking softly and lovingly, Bhagavan just says avoid that company. A thought may come into our mind in terms of saying no, but there would be situations where you can't avoid the company of such people, where really aggressive people may come and deal with us, which is really true. It can happen, as part of a social life. It can happen as part of a professional life. How do we deal with such situations? Bhagavan gives us an invaluable message and teaching on that too. By Bhagavan's grace, we'll look at that in the next episode when we talk about the glory and beauty of the Bharatiya culture, not just as an intellectual exercise, but also as with respect to how do we practically apply it. So an important takeaway for us today is Bhagavan says that the Atman is present everywhere. That is that belief is the foundational belief of the Bharatiya culture. In fact, the defining belief of the Bharatiya culture. That's what makes somebody a Bharatiya. And over the past 2 episodes, this one and the previous one, we've been talking about what is the implication of that on one's day-to-day living, and how does one apply that as part of our day-to-day living. What is Bhagavan taught us about that is what we've been ruminating on. By Bhagavan's grace, we'll continue this journey, offering everything that has been shared at Bhagavan's lotus feet. Jai Sai Ram.